Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Reed Stone. Alongside me is my co-host, Bob Foley, and our guest today is Fritz Gilbert. After working 33 years in corporate America in various roles in the aluminum industry, Fritz and his wife achieved early retirement in June of 2018 at the age of 55. Prior to his retirement, he started a blog to share his thoughts and the lessons he was learning during the journey of pre-retirement planning, and continued to write about his experiences on his current journey thus far through retirement. Fritz and his wife now enjoy spending their time at their cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia. His byline is helping people achieve a great retirement, and that's the goal of his website and his blog, which is the Retirement Manifesto. Fritz is also the author of the book, Keys to a Successful Retirement: Staying Happy, Active, and Productive in Your Retired Years. He is also the co-author of the 2023 research study, Retirement Perspectives and Attitudes Survey. In this episode, we want to discuss with Fritz the research study, his book, and his blog. Fritz, thanks for taking the time to talk with Bob and I today and to share your insights.
Well, thanks for having me on, Reed and Bob. It's a real honor. I'm really privileged to be a guest, so thank you very much.
So let's jump in. We've got a lot to cover with both touching on the research study, the book, and the blog. So if you would, Fritz, take us back to kind of your thought process, because if I've got the years right and the math right, you started your blog about 3 years prior to retirement. So you started kind of jotting down your thoughts and then sharing those with people. And then I think your book probably came up right shortly after retirement. Do I have that
That's
right?
correct.
So give us kind of your thought process and the timeline of those two.
Yeah, I'd be
items.
happy to. Really, I started blogging. I've always had an interest in podcasts and personal finance. I've considered myself a personal finance hobbyist for years. I read Money Magazine and Kiplinger's and all those when people still read magazines. So I've always been a DIY investor. I did actually have I know your primary clientele is the planning industry, and I did do a kind of a one-off retirement readiness review with a financial planner to make sure I didn't have any blind spots. So I recognize the dangers of DIY. I respect the professional financial consulting business tremendously. So I'm not anti-planning, but I've just always felt like I had the skill myself and felt comfortable with that. So I started about 3 years prior to retirement. And really at that time, I think most people at that stage, and I was the same, are focused on the financials. And the first year or two, we're really looking at, the financial readiness. When can I retire? Safe withdrawal rate, sequence of return risk, all the financial elements. And probably about a year before I retired, I started seeing more and more research on the importance of the non-financial side as well. So I started writing more posts, and you'll kind of see a shift in my writing in that time frame. And then the really kind of, I loved how the book came about. It was 2 years after I retired. And it was really, looking back now, 2 years in, I had a tremendously smooth transition to retirement. Went very well. You always hear about the messy middle and people that struggle. I didn't experience any of that. I had a really nice transition. We're loving life entirely in retirement. So it was kind of a look back and saying, okay, now that I've retired and, to this point, retired successfully, what lessons have I learned over the past 5 years, and how can I condense that down? And the book includes 24 tips that I kind of boiled down as the key elements to, in my case anyway, were what I feel the fundamental reasons that my transition went so well. And that was really the focus of the book. So it was kind of a nice way to encapsulate everything I'd learned over 5 years into a nice summary. And I've continued to write, in the 2 or 3 years since the book's come out. The interesting thing, though, Reed and Bob, is the majority of my writing now, I've found as I've gotten more and more into retirement, the financial stuff seems to become less important and less of a focus. You kind of know what you have, you learn to live with it, and you spend a lot more of your mind time thinking about kind of the purpose and the fulfillment of life. And you see that in my writing now. I write a lot fewer financial. I still weave them in. They're popular. I still look at my portfolio, and I can always write about that kind of stuff, Roth conversions, etc. So there's always a financial element to it. but I really enjoy writing now more on the non-financial aspects. I found that to be more meaningful at this stage in our retirement.
What piece of the non-financial are the tip of your spear?
The way I look at that, Bob, is if you think about what, besides your paycheck, when you were working, right? Everybody thinks about the paycheck. What am I going to do when the paycheck stops?
Right.
And the blind spot, and we'll talk about this in the research as well, I'm sure, but the thing that people miss, and this is where the financial planning community can really do a service to their clients, is help point out the non-financial benefits you also get from your job. And there's mainly 5 of them. One is your sense of identity, right? You go to a party, what do? You talk about your career, right? You have relationships, people that you work with. You have structure to your day. You have a purpose, right? You've got objectives from your boss. You've got deliverables, and you have that sense of accomplishment that comes when you achieve a task and you do it well and you get the pat on the back. So there are a variety of those non-financial benefits that you get from work in addition to your paycheck. And I would say thinking about those areas is really the focus of the non-financial aspects that I talk about.
Absolutely.
I want to share, Fritz, with you a couple of quotes from your book to get your thoughts, because as I started reading your book and following your blog, I took a lot of these quotes and I've used them. I've posted them on social media a few times, used versions of them with clients to try to get them to drive home these points of why planning for life and retirement is so important. So I'll read the 3 quotes from your book and then just get your thoughts on how you came to write these quotes in the way that you did. And then maybe we can tie all of those 3 quotes together. But here's the 3 that I pulled from your book. And I encourage viewers to go get Fritz's book. We'll share the book at the end, but he's got similar points sprinkled throughout the book. But here's the 3 that I found very interesting. And you say, the most important step in the process is determining what type of life you want to live in your retirement years. As you will see, this drives the financial aspects of retirement and has a direct impact on what you decide to do in retirement, where you decide to do it, and what issues you'll prioritize in your life. Quote number 2, an investment is a commitment of a resource that generates future returns. The time you spend planning for your retirement, and I think you're talking both financial and non-financial in that statement, the time you spend planning for your retirement is very much an investment, one that will pay back exceedingly high returns. And then the 3rd quote says, I am convinced that you will come to find that the drivers of a truly successful retirement extend far beyond the financial ingredients. So I think you talked about this a little bit earlier, Fritz, but how did you come to realize that each one of these points was important? And then how did you kind of choose to word them the way that you did?
Yeah, good questions. Great quotes. Thanks for pulling those out. I think the holistic statement I would make, somewhere along the way, I found the highest correlation to people that had a successful transition versus those that didn't was the amount of time they spent planning for their retirement. And this was probably 2 years before my retirement. This is when I started shifting away from purely the financial aspect of it. So the amount of time that you spend planning is directly correlated with how successful the transition is. And if you kind of break that down, that encompasses much more. You talk about what your life in retirement is going to be. It not only drives your financials, your costs, your estimated spend, but it drives you to start thinking about what life is going to be like after work is gone. And the more time you spend thinking about that, the less surprised you're going to be when work is gone. And suddenly, the people that struggle the most, we'll get into the study, but the people that struggle the most are the hard charging type A's. They're just focused on the goal. They're working hard. They don't think about much about life after work, and they get let go, downsized, fired. And they've had no time to plan. Those are the most at risk people. So it's inversely related, right? The people that plan the most have the best success. So every one of those quotes talk about the investment one. I really like the concept of investment being dedicating attention to a resource to allow it to pay future benefits. And the time that you spend focusing on the non-financial, especially, that to me is really the key that most people miss. And that's really why it's such a passion of mine. And I just wrote an article last week called The Three-Legged Stool of Retirement. And there's three legs. Everybody thinks of the money. The other one is time. The other one is health. And I make the argument in my post, I would argue money is the least important, because realistically, you're going to run out of time and you're going to run out of health, and you'll probably still have money. So it'll be the last leg standing. And yet we seldom spend anywhere near the amount of time investing our optimization of our time and optimization of our health. So you can invest in your health. You can exercise. You can, I do all those things. I'm very focused on fitness, and I'm very focused on, I look at time like a deck of cards in a hand of cards, like a poker hand. And you've got certain cards you can play. That's what you spend your time on. But once you retire, you're not committed to holding those same cards. You can put cards down, you can pick cards up. Curiosity is a huge driver for how you find your way through this retirement transition. And picking up a card just represents being curious and trying something new. And maybe you'll like it, maybe you'll keep it in your hand, maybe you won't, and you put it down. But I'm constantly thinking about, what cards am I holding in my hand, and are they the right cards for where I'm at in my life? So it kind of all ties around into that planning, and thinking about life beyond the financials is really the sweet spot for the retirement planning industry.
So I wanted to come back. Go ahead, Bob.
So if you're one of those guys that gets laid off or fired or whatever, and they find themselves out in the cold, what's your advice to help them to get past that messy middle?
Yeah, and Bob, most people will go through a messy middle, right? And this is where the financial planning industry can really help. Number one, make people aware that it's probably going to be a rough transition, especially those that get, let go unexpectedly.
Right.
The good news is most people work through it. And the research found that the happiest people in the entire survey are those that have been retired 2 years or longer. So even those that struggle and kind of go through, there's a good book, I'll throw it up here, Mike Drack. I think you were talking about, are there other resources you recommend? Mike Drack was one of those guys that got fired unexpectedly. And he went into what he calls retirement hell. And he found his way to retirement heaven, right? So he wrote a book about it. It's a good book. The good news is people do tend to work their way through it, but it can be a really tough transition. And the main way you find your way through it, okay, you're not starting until after you've retired, so you're starting late, but you kind of go through that same process that I went through 2 years before I retired. You start thinking about those non-financial areas of your life, and what are you going to do with your time, and how do you find purpose, and how do you develop relationships outside of work? Again, going back to those 5 things that you lose from work besides your paycheck, it's basically addressing each one of those. How do you want a structured day, or do you want an unstructured day? Going from a fully structured day to an entirely unstructured day without even thinking that it's going to happen is really disorienting. So add some structure to your day, right? Maybe you go to the gym Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 o'clock and take a class, right? You experiment with each one of those 5 elements. How do you build relationships? I started a retirement mastermind group in my community with 8 guys that are all kind of in my same demographic, and we have a great time. We meet once a month. It's building relationships. It's giving me a group of guys that we can talk to about what we're going through and what we're learning. Again, it's addressing each one of those 5 elements and finding your way through to kind of replace the way that you achieve those purposes without work being the one that's doing it for you. And it is a messy process, right? The numbers are easy. You put a spreadsheet together, you look at your net worth, you look at your withdrawal rate. The other stuff is kind of more left side, right side of the brain. It's more the artistic stuff. And that's a muscle that we haven't exercised, right? Since we were in kindergarten, probably. When you went out and played with the kids and you just did what you did. And it takes some time to learn how to get that side of the brain going again. And again, to me, curiosity is the word to think about. Listen to what you're thinking about and just experiment with different things, and you typically work your way through it. Retirement coaching is a huge field now that's exploded because of this. And I think that's a lost opportunity in the financial planning world. Why are people going to coaches? They're going to coaches because they're financial planners talking to them about money, but that's not what they're struggling with. They're struggling with all these other intangibles. And that's kind of what the retirement coaching industry has stepped into, is how to help people work their way through that.
Right. Now, you talked about your mastermind groups, which fascinates me. What are the topics that usually come up within that group?
Yeah, you know, Bob, I've written a couple articles about it, and one of the things we did in the first meeting is we said, look, we're gonna make this as interesting as we can. So I'm not going to lead all the meetings. I led the first meeting, and every one of the other leaders led the next meeting. And I said, the topic is your choosing. Tell us a week or so in advance. If you got some reading for us to do, send us a link to whatever you want us to read. And it's been all over the board. One guy wanted to talk about the blue zones. One guy, he's a options trader, and he just loves options. So we had an options trading class. I had one. I'm actually writing a post. It'll come out this week on finding joy in life, and their comments were excellent. I captured the 10 best comments, and I'm writing a blog post, 10 ways to find joy in life. So it's all over the gamut. But what's interesting, one talked very much about exercise. Outlive, Peter Attia, Dr. Attia. He wrote a really good book about fitness and yeah. So we talked about that. So I would say we've been 10, 11 meetings now, and probably only 2 of them have had a financial focus, and the other 8 or 9 have been on the non-financial elements. And that's just happened by the leaders talking about things that they think are important for where they're at. So it kind of reiterates the importance of this stuff.
That's great. Read, back to you.
Fritz, I wanted to go back to one of your comments earlier, and I think it comes from some research, from your research, that the happiest retirees are the ones who have spent 2 or more years in retirement. I think if I've got that right.
Yeah.
That seems to coincide very closely with what Bob and I do in the retirement coaching space, and that we tell people that it often takes people 6 months to 2 years to kind of get through that messy middle.
Yeah.
And so I think your research fits that exactly right. And the reason that the happiest retirees have been in retirement for 2 years is because they have had to dig through that messy middle, that retirement hell, that feeling lost, whatever we want to call it. And I think that's where this planning comes in handy, and why your transition was so smooth is, like you had said, you did that prior to retirement. So you didn't have to spend that 2 years trying to figure it out. And that's what Bob and I see with clients too. A lot of times people struggle. It takes a lot of introspection and really digging into what's really important in my life. What are my beliefs? What are my values? All of these things. And so for a lot of our clients, it takes digging into this stuff. It's not just saying, hey, figure out what your purpose is or what makes you happy, or hey, make a bucket list and go through those. It really takes some deep level conversation with clients to help kind of lead them through this, so they aren't stuck in this for 2 years, or some people are stuck in it longer. And to me, what that does is it wastes kind of that valuable time. Like you said in the 3-legged stool, time is one of the biggest things that we have going in retirement. And so people want to kind of hit the ground running in retirement and doing all these things. So back to kind of what you've been saying, and what Bob and I preach all the time, is do that planning up front. Do it 3 years, 5 years before retirement. Experiment, so when you get there, you can hit the ground running, doing all the things that you want. You don't have to spend your time going through the messy middle.
Yeah, actually, what came to my mind as you brought this up, I wrote 2 articles. One was why 28% of retirees are depressed. And after I wrote that article, I had a reader that sent me an email and said, hey, that's a negative slant. Why don't you write about the 72% that aren't depressed? I was like, that's a good idea. So I followed up with 72% that are happy. And what I found with the 72% that are happy, and if I were a financial planner, I would write these down and I would talk to every one of your clients and say, how many of these traits are on your list, right? And I really referred, as I was doing research on it, Wes Moss is all over this stuff, right? This is really his focus. And he wrote a book about what the happiest retirees know. And he found 9 common traits, maybe 10, that the happiest retirees demonstrate more so than those that are depressed. 3 of them are financial. Okay, fine. The first one is have at least $500,000 of investable assets. The second one is have your mortgage paid off, which peace of mind, that kind of makes sense. And the third is multiple streams of income. Again, it reduces the anxiety. So those are pretty straightforward. To me, the more interesting, I think there's 6 non-financial. One was a sense of curiosity, right? Exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The happiest retirees have found a way to harvest that curiosity. Second is they found at least 1, preferably 2 or 3 things that really give them a sense of purpose. My writing is one. My wife has a charity, Freedom for Fido. We build free fences for low-income families. That's a huge purpose for us. So we've got 2 or 3 purposes. The third is social connections, right? Again, these are the things that you lose when you walk away from your job. The social connections, my mastermind, right? How are you going to recreate relationships in a non-working environment? 4 is that you retire at your planned time. 60% of people retire earlier than they plan, right? It's a common, everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to work till I'm 65. Well, guess what? You're probably not, right? 60% of people don't make it to their planned retirement. And a lot of times it's downsizing, but it's also, maybe you have a spouse that's suddenly losing their health. You've got aging parents, whatever. There's a lot of health factors that drive earlier than planned retirement. So that one's a little more out of your control, but as a planner, as a financial planner, I would talk to your clients and say, look, 60% of people don't make it to their planned retirement age. So what's your plan if you have to retire 2 years early? Get them thinking about the possibility. The 5th one is personal health. We talked about that earlier. The importance of health, especially as you get older, it lets you live a more fulfilling life because you can still go do those things you've always dreamed about doing, and it gives you more years to do them. So focus on your personal health. And the last one is that you did planning for, you didn't just walk blindly into retirement. You made the investment in the appropriate planning. So I think those traits are really the things a financial planner should be talking with his clients about, in addition to just purely the financials.
Now, you talked about your spouse or your life partner. And in that 2 years or 3 years that you did your planning, how much did you involve that person?
Quite a bit, Bob. We had, I was writing about it every week. So I was probably more obsessed with this topic than most people. And I recognize the importance of including my wife. One of the things we did, which really worked out well, at the time we were still living in Atlanta. We've since sold that house and we live in the mountains full time. We knew that was going to be part of what the plan was. But while we were still living in the city, we came up here over Thanksgiving. We took an extra week. So we had like 10 days off. This was maybe a year before I retired. And we said, look, you can't really make it like retirement because it's kind of like getting married. You don't know until you're married what it's like to be married. Let's try to, as much as we can, let's try to put ourselves in the mindset of, wow, we're going to be here full time when we retire. What's that going to be like? And one of the discussions we had was, I call it me time, she time, and we time, right? How much time do you want to do things with your friends that I'm going to say, fine, she's out right now. She went out to lunch with some friends. Great. I knew that. I'm over here doing my podcast with you guys. That's great. This is me time, right? You don't want to just randomly end up together all the time and not have a little bit of discussion on the front end about how much time do you want for yourself? Do we want to do everything together, or do you want a couple hours a day or a couple hours a week? So we had those types of discussions. And that gets into that relationship element of what you lose when you leave your workforce.
Right.
Your primary relationship when you retire is your spouse or your partner. And doing what you can on the front end to make sure you're kind of preparing yourselves for the adjustment. It's as big of an adjustment for the non-working spouse as it is for the one that's retiring. Absolutely. And they have to be an integral part of that discussion.
Well, 50% of the retirees are solo agers. So what advice do you have for solo agers?
Yeah, I think about with our charity, we've got a lot of solo agers. One guy in particular, dear friend of ours, lost his wife, ALS, horrible way to die. Yeah. And he has done a really good job of staying connected and building those connections, getting involved in charity work. He's keeping himself busy. And the things that he's choosing to keep himself busy with, probably not by coincidence, are things that involve interactions with other people, right? So he's trying. It's still hard. Let's not kid ourselves, especially when you're widowed. but he's trying to the best of his ability to establish as much human connection as he can, with the loss of his spouse. But he still talks about, the evenings at home are really hard on him. And, I think that's a lifelong struggle. But doing the best you can to recognize the importance of human connection and investing in that with your time, right? All these same elements, using some of that time to make sure you're investing it in relationships with others, even if you're single, is really important.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned widowhood. The thing I was struck by, there was a study out, I guess about a year ago or so, and the average age of widow or widowers today is 59 years old.
Wow, I did not know that.
And there's 18 million of them out
Wow.
there. And about 60% of the group remarries or gets married again or gets with a significant other within 5 years. But the rest of the group does not. So
yeah,
it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, and the other thing we should probably touch on with that, Bob, is the phenomenon of gray divorce, right? Gray divorce is a real phenomenon, and that really happens, I think, when, let's say the husband's been traveling his whole career and he's seldom home, and suddenly he's home all the time, and they haven't prepared for it, and they're driving each other crazy, right? I mean, great. I don't know what the numbers are. I wrote an article on it, but I can't remember the numbers. But that's another startling statistic of how many people, how many of the baby boomers, let's say, are recognizing, hey, this isn't the person I want to spend my retired years with. That's a shame.
Yeah, and that's the fastest growing group getting divorced today too.
Yeah.
Take it away, Reed.
Fritz, I want to jump back to the blog post that you mentioned, because when I read the blog, why 28% of retirees are depressed, the way that I viewed that was, oh my gosh, more than 1 in 4 people are depressed in retirement. And so even before I read the article, I'm like, that's got to change. I mean, we have to do something about it. Well, then you wrote the follow-up, why 72% are happy, which I'm glad you did, because then you kind of countered that original negative post with, well, here's what we can do to change that. And that's really what I was kind of looking at. One of the things that I find interesting when I read your blogs too is not only is there great information in the blogs, but there's great information from people in the comments, because they will share their personal experiences in those comments. So I'm curious, kind of over the years, what you've pulled out of some of those blog posts about life and retirement. What are some of your readers either sharing with you or questions that they're asking you about preparing for life and retirement? Yeah,
that's another good question, Reed. I think, to me, the comments, and I'm blessed to have a very engaged audience. It's not uncommon to get 100 comments on a post, which just blows me away, right? I'm just some guy writing in his office here, and people resonate with it. And I think what I hear from readers a lot is we really like reading your stuff because you're just one of us. You're a guy that's going through this with your wife, and a lot of the blogs are written by kind of the FIRE community. I've got a lot of friends in the FIRE community, nothing wrong with that. But, the more traditional retirees don't necessarily relate to that as well. And there aren't a lot of blogs that are written by kind of the traditional retirees. So I think that's really, most of my comments are kind of the more traditional retiree demographic. And I guess my biggest takeaway, I've written a lot of articles where I'll cite, this was driven by this comment from a reader, and I'll write a post about it. The 72% that are happy was a case of that. I think my biggest takeaway is we all think we're kind of struggling with this stuff. Maybe we're unique. We're not unique at all, right? Everybody goes through a very similar, this messy middle thing. You talk about the 28% that are depressed. One thing I wish I would have included, and I don't know if I ever could have found it, but I would suspect that, if you look at the first 2 years after retirement, the depression rate, let's say unhappy, is probably over 50%, right? Because that's when you're struggling through it. And if you look at people that are 2 years plus, it's probably much lower, right? So it's an amalgamation of both those populations. My guess is it's a bipolar. That's not right. It's not an equal distribution, right? The people that have been retired
Right.
longer are happier, which
Yeah.
goes back to that point. People do work through it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you helped develop an interesting research survey earlier this year, along with our previous guest, Eric Weigel, on the topic of retirement planning, titled Retirement Perspectives and Attitude Survey. So how did the two of you kind of come together? And I asked this question of Eric too, but I wanted to get your perspective of
Yeah.
how did you come to do the research? And then what really was the goal of the research? What did you two set out to try to accomplish when you did the research?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I wrote a review on his book. I think it was a good book, and it kind of talks about this topic. And he actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, Fritz, I like your content. I think we're very like-minded." And he started talking about, this was my sweet spot. And I talk about this in my book. The thing that I was borderline obsessed with as I'm preparing for retirement is what's it going to be like when I get there, right? There's no way to know, right? Oh, every day is a Saturday, oh, you can take as long a vacation as you want. That doesn't capture it. It's so much bigger than that. So there's very little that talks about what is retirement actually like? And once you get into retirement, how does it compare to what you thought it was going to be, right? That's a black hole. And Eric was basically talking around, hey, maybe we can do something where we can kind of compare what people are thinking about before they retire to what people are recognizing after they retire and compare the results. And I was like, jackpot, perfect, love it. And off we went. So the whole goal, to your point, what was the purpose? It was to really look for blind spots. What are people thinking about as they're planning for retirement? And what do they realize after the fact that they should have been thinking about as they were preparing for retirement? What are the gaps? And I think it's pretty groundbreaking. We've gotten a lot of opportunities to talk about it. We talked about it on Morningstar, right? Some pretty high profile areas that I think have also recognized this is not an area that a lot of people have dug into. So it was pretty fertile ground, and some really nice findings came out of it.
Yeah, it's perception versus reality, right? It's
Exactly.
what we perceive retirement to be like versus what are we learning from people who have now been in retirement? What are they telling us that they wish they had looked back and done prior to retirement? So
yeah,
I think you mentioned, and I think this is mentioned in the description of the study, but one of the areas of interest you and Eric had in conducting the survey, like you said, was comparing the answers of retirees, what retirees were telling you versus what people still working at, but planning ahead. So dive into some of the findings, if you will, Fritz. Give us 2 or 3 findings or the main takeaways that you came away with from the studies.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours about just this topic, and I wrote a blog post that kind of summarized the key findings. Eric published the actual survey results on his blog. I wrote more of a color commentary about it on mine. So we agreed on that on the beginning, and you can certainly look at my blog and find it. But my title is something about blind spots. So if you just type blind spots on my blog, you'll find it. But the biggest one to me, and I had heard this from people, as I was preparing for retirement, I would keep in touch with people as they retired, right, from my workplace. And it was surprisingly common how many of them said, man, that was a lot bigger transition than I expected, right? So I kind of had a perception of that going in, but it came out in the findings. And to me, this was probably the biggest finding of the survey. And the question was, if you've not yet retired, do you expect the transition will be smooth? Or if you've already retired, was the transition smooth? Pre-retirees, 52% said, yep, it's going to be smooth. 52%. Actual retirees, only 32% said it was smooth. A 20% gap. That's massive, right? You think about whatever it is, 100,000 retirees a day or 10,000 retirees a day. That's 2,000 retirees a day that are struggling more than they expected. Huge, huge finding. And what that tells you is, hey, this stuff matters that we're talking about right now. And planning on it at the front end is going to help you be one of those people that does have the smooth transitions. That was number one. The second thing I think was, what do you, for pre-retirees, what do you expect you'll miss from your career? And from post-retirees, what do you miss from your career? And these were pretty interesting too. The huge blind spot was the social interaction. 29% of pre-retirees say, yeah, maybe I'll miss my coworkers. I don't have a lot of great friends there. I got a couple, but I'll be fine, right? I'll still keep in touch with them. We'll go to lunch. No, you don't, right? Let's not kid ourselves. We'll keep in touch. You never do. So 29% of pre-retires think, I'm not going to miss my social connections from work. You know how many of the actual retirees miss social connections? 62%. That's what is that, 33% difference. Yeah. It's a massive, massive gap. So that goes back to this relationship thing and the importance of building what I call non-working relationships. Find a way to build your relationships outside of your workplace. So many of us have the vast majority of our relationships in our workplace. We're there every day. We have common interests. We're sitting side by side. We're talking about stuff. We're water cooler, coffee breaks, meetings. You're always with those people, and those are your relationships. That's gone when you retire. And if you haven't spent time building this outside of the workplace relationship side, you'll feel it. And 62% say that was the biggest thing they missed. So that probably, those two things were probably the two biggest surprises that I took away from it. Really significant findings.
The sociability thing is a key. And what people don't understand is once they aren't working and they're homebound or in the community bound, they have to then reach out and reform their social circles.
Exactly.
Can you give them some advice? Give us some advice on what you've heard or what you feel about how to reform those social circles successfully.
Yeah. I mean, I'm biased because my wife started this charity and it's been just tremendously successful.
Sure.
But let me just use that as an example, because I think when you're working, by definition, you have to be a little bit selfish, right? You're taking care of your family. You're earning your paycheck. Your time is committed to doing that. It's all about you and doing stuff you have to do to live. When you retire, you don't have to do that anymore, right? You're financially independent. So
Right.
what is that? That gives you the freedom to do with your time what you want to do instead of what you have to do. And the biggest thing that people can do, in my view, is find a way to look for a need in your community and look for a way to fill that gap. Or maybe find a charity that's already working in the community that's an area that you're really passionate about. I hate the homeless people. Okay, fine. Go work at a homeless shelter, whatever. I love dogs. Great. Go walk dogs at a shelter, right? We've got a lot of our friends. We're in the dog community because we build these fences with Freedom for Fido. But what it does, Bob, it's not just doing the work that helps others, which is tremendously rewarding, right? When you identify a need, we went up yesterday and this guy lived in a ratty mobile home, super nice guy, dirt poor. And he had his dogs out on these chains because, he was trying to take care of his dogs. He didn't want them getting hit by cars on the road, whatever. He was doing the best he could do, but it's all he could afford. And when we left yesterday, these 3 dogs were running around the yard. They'd never run. And they were running around the yard playing with each other. It's so rewarding, right? And this guy was so appreciative. So you get that benefit. But more importantly, we have what we call the Fido family now. And there's like 200 volunteers, maybe 50 of them are really active. And somebody will shoot a text out on a Friday, 2:00. Hey, anybody want to get together at one of the microbrews today? And 20 of us will just show up. We do stuff together all the time. We have a standing pickleball appointment on Thursdays, 2:00 at the rec center. And right. Whoever wants to go play pickleball, and guess what? There's like 12 people there every Thursday from the Fido family. So this Fido family has in essence replaced that work relationship environment where we have a common cause, we're getting that sense of fulfillment. We have a sense of purpose. We have a sense of identity, and we're all doing it together. Jackpot, right? So charitable work is really important for one potential avenue to explore.
Right. You built a community.
Yeah. And we did not see that coming. That was an unexpected benefit that I would say is even more valuable than the good feeling you get from giving back to others. The sense of community is even more rewarding than that.
Absolutely. Reed, I know you got some other follow-up questions, so come on.
Well, we're getting short on time here, but one thing I did want to ask you about the study, and I posed this question to Eric too, because I know a large number of the respondents came from your viewership on your blog. And so because a lot of the viewers on your blog answered these questions, one of the things that I wondered how you and Eric interpreted the results was, I'm wondering if some of the gaps between some of those blind spots would be larger if the survey was amongst kind of people who hadn't previously read your blogs and kind of already had this built-in thought process of how to answer these. So I think what your research really kind of spotlights too is that there's even a bigger gap than I think what
Yes.
we realize there, because again, your readers are plugged into, and if they've been following you over the years, they kind of already were aware of many of these blind spots. So I think that may have skewed the results slightly. So I just wanted
Absolutely.
to kind of get your thoughts on that. I would love to see a survey like that, just going out to kind of the general population of people who are planning for retirement versus these people who kind of went through that messy middle and came out the other side. Because I think that would be really interesting.
I couldn't agree more, Reed. And Eric and I have talked about that. We're not sure how to do it, to be honest. We've talked with some other people, and that may be the next phase of the research. I mean, we talked about, this 20% gap between, will retirement be smooth? I would bet it's a 50% gap if you look at the general population, because there was a self-selection bias in the way we did the survey. It's the only way we had to do it. But everybody that took the survey are people that read retirement blogs. They're thinking about it. They're planning for it. So the general population, and if you're a financial planner, right, listening to the show, you're dealing with that general population mass. So that gap is definitely bigger. So even more important, if you're in the financial planning industry and you're talking to a couple that's, 2 years out from retirement, man, let them know, you know what, it's probably going to be a lot rougher than you think it's going to be. Have you looked at the survey, right? Make them aware of these non-financial elements, because if you look at where the blind spots were, they were in the non-financial aspects of this. Mm-hmm. And as you said, they were understated. Even as dramatic as they were, they still don't represent how bad it really is. So yeah, I agree. And that's hopefully something we can do in the future. Yeah,
that would be awesome, because there's just so much information to share with people on those topics. And glad you were able to be here to share this, Fritz. I'm going to pull up your contact information. While I'm doing that, is there anything else you wanted to point out, Fritz? We could talk about the survey for an hour. We could talk about your book for an hour, and we could talk about your blog for an hour. So I tried to cram a lot of that in. I will just say to the viewers, as I pull up your contact information, check out Fritz's book, check out his blog, follow what he's talking about, because that's what people are interested in when they plan for retirement. So I'll pull that up and I'll send it over to you for final thoughts.
Thanks, Reed, as you pull that up. I guess the last thing I would probably say, especially knowing your audience is primarily the people that are really in a position to help people retire. By definition, when they're coming to you, they're asking about the financials. When can I retire? Am I going to be okay? They're talking with you about the financial stuff because that's their perception of you, is you're their financial planner. And I would just really encourage you to expand your boundaries. Number one, they're paying you AUM or however your pay structure is. They're paying you, and you've got to find a way to justify that return and provide them information that they don't know about to demonstrate your value. And they don't probably recognize, to the comment we just had about the general population, these blind spots, they don't know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. And I would really encourage you to broaden your discussion beyond the financials. And I guess the last thing I would say about that is I wrote a post called the 90-10 Rule of Retirement. And it was, I won't take credit for it. It was another guy. I just drew a blank on his name. He's a coach. It's in my article. But he talks, and he actually threw the term out there. I was, man, that's spot on. As I was getting ready for retirement, you're totally focused on the numbers. It's, when can I retire? When can I retire? And somebody said to me at one point, once you retire, you worry a lot less about the numbers. You kind of have what you have, as I said earlier. You get used to living on it. So we came up with this 90-10 rule of retirement, which basically states, as you're preparing for retirement, 90% of your focus is on the financial stuff. After you've retired, 90% of your focus is on the non-financial stuff. And even if your clients don't listen to you when you're urging them about the importance of finding the way to replace all these non-financial benefits you're currently getting from your workplace, they may not believe you. They may not really listen, but make the point in those 2 years before retirement when they're thinking about this stuff, because once they get to the other side and they recognize it was a blind spot, they're going to remember that you were warning them about that. You're going to get a gold star. And they're going to say, oh, I remember my guy was trying to warn me about this stuff. I should have listened to him. I'm going to talk to him and see what else he has to say. And you just earn some points, right? So weave this into your practice. It's as important as the financial stuff. I would argue it may be more important than the financial stuff, as radical as that sounds. This stuff really matters. So hand out a copy of my book to your clients. I've got other planners that are doing that, actually. The book is, one chapter is focused on the financials. The other 4 chapters are focused on the non-financials by design. That will be something to get them talking about and recognizing the importance of this stuff.
I think another point you make I think it might be in one of the blog posts we discussed, Fritz, but another point you make is that people should be willing to reach out for help if they need it.
Yeah.
So when they're going through the messy middle, they're trying to dig themselves out. That's one of the things Bob and I do. So there's hundreds of other people doing what we're doing. So there are plenty of resources to reach out to somebody to get help. So if your clients need help, as a financial advisor, don't feel like you have to try to help them yourself. There are people out there who've been through the transition themselves. They've helped clients navigate the transition.
Yeah.
So,
along those lines, Reed, I
Yeah.
draw the analogy like this. If you're a financial planner, you're not an accountant, you're not a CPA, but what do you tell your clients all the time? Oh, check with your CPA about this, right?
Yeah.
You should have, you've got a relationship with that CPA world. You should have, as a financial planner, you should have that same connection with the coaching world. And you should have a coach maybe under contract for your firm and say, look, we've got a coaching guy on staff, and maybe you work out a structure. I mean, you guys, that's what you do. I don't know how you structure that, but you've got it as one of the services you provide. And if they're struggling and they come to you, you say, hey, I know this guy named Reed. He actually works for our firm. Let me put you in contact with him. It's, part of what we offer, whatever. Absolutely. That should be an auxiliary service that any financial planning firm has readily available. There's a huge need for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think financial advisors need to feel like they have to learn something new, take on a whole other responsibility. It's like you said, they partner with estate planning attorneys, they partner with CPAs, they partner with insurance people. So we're just another tool in their toolbox.
Yeah.
So you can learn more about Fritz. Again, his website and his blog is the Retirement Manifesto, retirementmanifesto.com. You can learn more about the research study on his website. He wrote a blog that summarizes the research study. The full research study is available on Eric Weigel's website, Retire with Possibilities, who we had on last episode. Check out Fritz's book. You can find it on Amazon. Email Fritz with any questions you might have. You can find Fritz is pretty active on X also. So yeah, thanks Fritz for joining us again and sharing everything you've been working on pre-retirement, into retirement, sharing what you're learning, as you make this journey through retirement.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Reed and Bob, and I really applaud what you guys are doing. I think it still is a blind spot. If we talk about blind spots, it's a blind spot in the financial planning industry about how important this stuff is. And you're trying to address that. You're shining a light on it. And I'm honored to get a chance to play a small role in that effort. So thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
Again.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Fritz. Thanks everybody for joining us on this episode. We'll see you next time when we continue exploring retirement and longevity planning beyond the numbers.